I'm going to show you exactly how to use I language to communicate more assertively. This is the first video in a 5-part series about assertive communication skills, and I'll put links to all 5 parts as I post them in the description below this video. I language is perhaps the #1 principle for communicating assertively. I'll explain the difference between I language and you language, show you 3 ways to use I language to communicate assertively, and I'll give you 2 bonus tips to guard against the perception of being self-centered when using I language, which is a really common criticism. In short, I language is where you literally use the word I, perhaps me or my, to express yourself rather than using the word you. For example, I feel frustrated is an example of using I language to communicate assertively rather than you are frustrating me, which can clearly sound more aggressive because it sounds like you're pointing the finger. You. And this typically escalates conversations unnecessarily. But I language comes across as assertive and keeps the conversation in emotionally neutral territory. When we use you language, as in you are frustrating me, that instantly casts the other person in the conversation as the villain, as the problem. That sends the conversation into a negative feedback loop. The other person is very likely to see that as an accusation. The person will then feel more defensive, and they'll spend their time in the conversation justifying their actions instead of addressing the problem that you brought up. This almost instantly escalates what could be a regular conversation into a conflict because you are then more likely to double down on your approach and use even more you language to make sure you get your point across. Now, I get that it might feel good to temporarily get your frustrations off your chest, but this negative feedback loop creates a huge conversational barrier to overcome before either person can work on solving the actual problem. You language, in other words, decreases and delays the chances that you'll get your needs met. That's my sales pitch to avoid you language. Now let's turn to talk about I language as a reliable way to communicate assertively. Returning to our very simple example so far, I feel frustrated may sound like a small difference, but it can have a big impact because it can potentially lead to a positive assertive feedback loop. When you speak using I language, that says to the other person, here is a problem without pointing the finger at them, and that positions the listener as a potential co-problem solver rather than the villain in the story, and then they are more likely to offer support compared to when you might use you language. Now, is I language a magic bullet? No, this is not a guarantee that the other person will respond without escalating, but I language is much more likely to lead to a better outcome because of the principle of conversational reciprocity. The way we communicate is contagious, you might say. People and conversations tend to communicate in similar ways that mirror each other. And when you start your part of the conversation on the right foot, that creates an opportunity for the other person to mirror you and communicate openly in a similar way about what they need using I language as well. Given that foundation, here are 3 ways to use I language to communicate your interests assertively. We're going to use an acronym I came up with, S.E.W, S-E-W, to help you remember these 3 points. First, use I language to describe the situation. This is your interpretation of what you're seeing and experiencing. Instead of using you language to say something like you are wrong or your interpretation is off, start your talking turn by saying, here's how I see it, or I see it differently. You can use the words my, of course, instead of I. It accomplishes the same thing. My view of the situation is, from my perspective, here's my take on the situation. So S stands for situation. Second, the E stands for emotion. You can frequently use I language to talk about how you feel and what you're experiencing personally on an emotional level. Instead of saying, you are frustrating me, use I language to say, I feel frustrated. I feel overwhelmed. I am burned out. One of the most challenging parts of using I language is not to slip back into using you language in the second half of these statements or in these conversations. And this takes a little bit of work. But for example, instead of saying, I feel frustrated because you are giving me so much work, which clearly slips back into you language, the goal is to maintain I language through the rest of the sentence by saying, I feel frustrated because I have so much work to do. Now, you might be saying to yourself, yes, but what if the other person really is giving you too much work? And that's exactly the cause of your frustration. My answer is, I get it. That might be the case, But what I'm saying is that research shows that voicing your concerns using I language is much more likely to get the outcome you want out of the conversation. If you want to use you language to point the finger, blame the other person, that almost guarantees you're going to have an unproductive conversation that escalates into a conflict very quickly. In contrast, assertive communication is a strategic choice. So the question is, do you want to solve the problem or do you want to blame the other person? And since this video is about assertive communication, I language is a much better way to solve the problem because it starts the conversation on the right foot. So yes, the other person may be a central part of the problem, but I'm recommending you still find a way to express yourself using I language. The S stands for situation, E stands for emotion, and third in our acronym, the W stands for what you want. This means asking for or stating what you want or need in the situation. Instead of using you language, you need to give me more time off, which clearly sounds like demanding and confrontational. You would say, I would like to take some vacation time. Instead of you need to do some of these projects yourself, say, I need to take some of these lower priority projects off my plate. Now, on the other side of the coin, if you're not used to speaking directly, you may be saying to yourself, geez, this still sounds pretty direct. Yes, assertive communication is direct. And that might feel like a stretch if you're used to hinting around or hoping the other person notices what you really mean. But I language helps you maintain your assertiveness without pointing the finger at the other person and also without expecting the other person to read your mind. The key is using I language means you have done your best on your side of the conversation because you've communicated your interests assertively and directly without casting the other person as the problem, as the villain. You may also notice that you can use these 3 points, the situation, emotion, and what you want, as individual talking points, or you can use them to work your way through a complex and layered situation. That's up to you, depending upon the needs of the conversation and how it develops. One of the common criticisms of using I language is that it can sometimes come across as self-centered. And I have to say, this criticism might be fair in some cases. I've been around people who continuously frame everything they say with I. The whole conversation is about them, like they're some self-centered celebrity. So yes, you can overdo this. In that light, I have 2 bonus tips to avoid the perception of being overly self-centered. First, make sure you use I language when you feel the need to be assertive, but you also sense that you want to avoid a potential conflict. For example, you may be about to ask the person for something they may not want to give. Maybe there's an issue that you need the other person on board with and to help you solve. But that doesn't mean you should use I language in every situation to frame every statement. If you use it once in a while as needed, then it's unlikely anyone is going to consider you to be self-centered. The second way to almost guarantee that you don't come across as self-centered is to be a fantastic listener. So either before or after you express your interests, flip the S.E.W script and make sure you ask questions about the other person and how they see the situation, how they feel about it, and ask them what they want. If you ask questions and you're a great listener, this will neutralize the perception that you're self-centered because nobody sees good listeners as self-centered. Here's a summary of the ways you can use I language and 2 of the bonus tips to avoid the perception of being self-centered. You may want to pause the video and practice 1 repetition each using I language for the situation, the emotion, and what you want. I language is considered by many people to be the foundational principle of assertive communication, and I'll be referring to it in a couple of the other lessons in this series on assertive communication skills. As mentioned, this is just part 1 in a 5-part series. In part 2, we'll look at how to be assertive without being either aggressive or submissive from a completely different angle. We'll see you then.